The Bosendorfer hadn't been played in 10 years, and Maren Calloway could hear that the moment her fingers found its keys in the humid dark of the auction house. She was 27, and she'd stopped seeing the world 3 years back, on the night a fire took her sight and took her twin sister Della along with it. So now she read everything through her hands, and through the small tremors most people never notice. She could tell you a room's size by how sound fell in it. She could tell you a piano's whole history by the tension left sleeping in its strings. That's what she'd come to do. Tune a $200,000 instrument the auction house had booked her to make perfect for some buyer who'd never given his name, and she'd have finished it and gone home if the crowd hadn't shifted. A glass shattered somewhere, a voice rose, and suddenly 30 bodies were moving at once, and her cane caught between 2 floorboards, and she went forward with both hands out to catch herself. One palm landed flat on a man's chest. She registered the suit first. Wool so fine it felt like water, the kind of thing that costs more than most people earn in a season. Then she registered the thing underneath it, and everything in her went still, because his heart wasn't beating the way a heart should. It stumbled. It raced and caught and skipped like something running from itself in the dark. A rhythm so wrong and so carefully hidden that only a woman who'd spent 3 years listening with her skin would ever have felt it. She should have stepped back. Every rule of politeness she owned told her to apologize and move on, but her hand stayed, and her curiosity caught on that broken rhythm like cloth on a nail, and before she could decide whether it was wise, she reached up and laid her fingers along a jaw that was sharp and clenched and cold, with the effort of holding something in. The man didn't move. He'd gone the particular kind of still that isn't surprise, the stillness of a creature that has learned not to flinch when something touches it, because flinching means feeling. His name was August Rail, 34 years old, and in the city that ran along the Mississippi, he was the kind of man whose name people lowered their voices to say. He owned the docks. He owned the quiet arrangements that moved beneath them. He owned, above all, the flawless control that had kept a single secret buried for 6 years, a secret he'd never spoken to his oldest advisor, never let a doctor write down, never once said out loud, because in his world a weak heart is a death sentence written in someone else's hand. And this blind stranger had found it in 30 seconds. She tilted her face up toward a man she'd never see, and she said it plainly, without fear, the way she'd tell a client their shoulder was carrying grief they hadn't named. "You're in pain," she said, "and you're hiding it." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever stood inside. If stories about the people the world overlooks, the ones who see most clearly with their eyes closed, are the kind that stay with you, then do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's step back into that dark auction house and find out what a man who feels nothing does when someone finally feels everything. He did not answer at once, and Maren let that silence stretch, because she had learned long ago that silences often said more than words, and this silence was so full she could almost hear it. She felt that he had not stepped back, had not pushed her hand away, had not done any of the things a man touched on the chest by a stranger should have done, and that very stillness told her she had touched something no one was allowed to touch. When his voice came, it was low and slow, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being listened to, without ever having to raise his voice. He asked who she was, and in those 3 words there was a guardedness she recognized at once, because she had heard it in the bodies of so many clients, the tightness of someone who had just been seen through and did not know what to do with it. She drew her hand back slowly, not hurriedly as if apologizing, but carefully, like someone setting down something fragile. She said her name was Maren Calloway, and apologized for her hands. It was a professional habit, and sometimes it moved faster than her manners. She tilted her head toward his voice, locating him within her own darkness, and she felt that he was still standing there, close enough for her to smell wool, something like cedar and old paper, and beneath it all the faltering cadence of a heartbeat she could no longer keep herself from hearing. He asked what profession, not quite as a question, but as a test, the way a person taps lightly on a wall to find the hollow place. She answered that she tuned pianos. The auction house had hired her. There was a Bosendorfer that needed to be brought back to proper pitch before it was sold to some buyer who had never given a name, someone who wanted it perfect, and was willing to pay a great deal for that perfection. She had come to make that piano sing again, and on her way to it, the crowd had knocked her down. She said it calmly, as though falling against a stranger's chest and reading his secret. There were only a minor inconvenience in the evening, and she felt something change in his silence, the faintest shift, like ice moving when something beneath it has altered. He said she had read that, just from one touch, and his voice was lower now, more controlled, as if he were tightening his grip around something trying to slip loose. Maren nodded, though she was not sure whether he could see the nod, and with a little private amusement she realized she was trying to imagine what his eyes were doing with her face, an old habit that had never quite died. She said she could not read much, and that was the truth, because she did not know what illness that faulty rhythm belonged to, did not dare name it, only knew that it was a heart trying hard to hide itself. She only felt that something was out of rhythm. A tension where there should have been peace. She worked with this all day, he knew, with wood and strings, and after a while the hands no longer knew how to tell the difference between what a piano was holding and what a person was holding. Both grew tense in the same way. He fell silent again, and this time the silence had a different quality, no longer guarded, but something closer to astonishment. The astonishment of a man who had spent years building walls around himself, and had just discovered someone had walked through them without even knowing they existed. At last he told her that she should go on with her work, Miss Calloway, and there was courtesy in it, but there was also a door being closed, gently and firmly. Maren was not offended. She was used to doors. She found her cane again, set it upright between two floorboards, and turned according to the map she had built in her head from the room's echoes, 3 steps to the east wall, then along it toward the place where the Bosendorfer was waiting. She wished him a good evening over her shoulder, and said she hoped he found someone to talk to about what he was hiding. It was heavier than he thought, and carrying it alone for too long was not good for the heart. She had not meant the last part as a prophecy. It simply slipped out, that blunt honesty she no longer bothered to restrain, but she heard his breath catch for the briefest instant, and she knew she had touched that place again. Then she went on, her white cane tapping lightly against the wooden floor, disappearing into the sounds of people and glasses and whispered bidding, leaving August Rails standing alone in the middle of the crowd he owned, his hand still carrying the memory of where her palm had rested, watching the blind woman vanish behind rows of velvet chairs with a feeling he had no name for, a strange curiosity aching like light, slipping through the crack of a door in a room he had kept closed for a very long time, and he remained there long after she had disappeared, unmoving, listening to his own heart beat its familiar erratic pulse, wondering, for the first time 6 years, whether it had always been that loud, or whether it only seemed that way because someone else had heard it too. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old building in the Marigny, where the wooden floorboards creaked at frequencies Maren had memorized so completely that she could cross them inside her own darkness without slowing her steps. And when she opened the door near midnight, she heard Josie before she smelled the scorched spaghetti rising from the kitchen. Josie cried out that thank God, Maren was finally home, her voice filling the whole room the way Josie's voice always did, spilling into every corner like poured water. And Maren smiled despite her exhaustion, because after 3 years of living together, Josie's noise had become a kind of comforting background sound, a living counterweight to the stillness Maren carried inside. Josie said she had ruined dinner, had argued with the guy at the cafe, and had decided to quit her job for the 3rd time that month. But Maren had to tell her about the $200,000 piano, whether it was as beautiful as people said, and whether she had been allowed to touch it. Maren set her cane in its familiar corner by the door, hung her coat on the 2nd hook from the left, and let the question pass through her for a while before answering, because there was one story she could tell, the story of the unveiling, a grand masterpiece, whose voice had long been locked away in the dark. And there was another story she could not tell, not because she did not trust Josie, but because she did not yet understand it well enough to put it into words. She said it was beautiful, and that was half the truth. Its wood remembered everything. She had tuned it for almost 3 hours, and by the end, it sang as though it had never been forgotten. Josie said something about wishing she also had a job that made objects sing again instead of burning spaghetti. And Maren laughed, and she poured herself a glass of water. And through all of it, that unsteady murmur remained in her palm, like an echo that refused to fade. She had held many hearts in her life, literally, had laid her hand on clients' chests to count their rhythm, while easing muscles locked tight from stress. And she knew very well what a healthy heart sounded like, the steady, confident beat of a machine that trusted itself. But what she had felt tonight was not that. It was a heart running away, a fractured pace hidden beneath a layer of control so thick that it had taken 3 years of living through her hands for her to recognize it, and what she could not shake was not its irregularity, but its loneliness, the feeling that the man had carried that silent storm for a very long time, without ever letting anyone hear it. She lay down in bed a while later, in a darkness that was no different from light to her, and let her mind return to that moment, the hard line of his jaw beneath her fingers, his stillness, and with a little confusion, she realized she was thinking about a stranger, the way people think about a puzzle that has not yet been solved. And then, as it always did in the quietest hours, the memory of Della rose up, not violently, only as a familiar presence at the edge of her awareness, the laughter of the twin sister she would never hear again, and the old thought she had learned to live with, but had never truly released. The thought that she should have been the one upstairs that night, that if she had not switched rooms with her sister at the last minute, perhaps the person breathing now, tuning pianos now, lying in this darkness now, would have been Della and not her. She did not cry. She had moved past that stage long ago, and now the pain was more like a room she sometimes entered and then left than a storm. But tonight something was different, because for the first time in a very long while, when she thought about a heart carrying its burden alone, she did not think only of the man at the auction house. She thought of herself too, of the weight she still hid beneath her calm in exactly the same way he hid his stumbling heartbeat, and she wondered, just before sleep pulled her under, whether she had recognized him so quickly, because she also knew too well what it felt like to carry something too heavy to name, and whether there had ever been anyone in this world who had placed a hand on her chest and spoken aloud what she was hiding the way she had done with him. The next morning, Mrs. Ferreira arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, just as she had on the first Thursday of every month for the past 2 years, and Maren heard her on the stairs before she knocked. The way her right foot came down a little heavier than her left, the slightly hurried breathing of a 68-year-old woman who had just climbed 2 flights, and Maren had already opened the door before she could raise her hand to knock, something that always made Mrs. Ferreira laugh and say that this girl had a 6th sense. But it was not a 6th sense, Maren knew that. It was only the other 5 senses being listened to so carefully that people mistook it for magic. And when Mrs. Ferreira lay down on the treatment table, and Maren placed her hands on the woman's shoulders, she read it at once, like reading a familiar page, that something had changed since their last session. Maren said Mrs. Ferreira had been staying up late again, her fingers moving along the band of muscle that ran down the woman's neck, and not because of insomnia as usual. The muscle there was not tired in the way of exhaustion. It was tired in the way of worry. She was waiting for something. Mrs. Ferreira was silent for a long while, then sighed, the sigh of someone who had just been seen through, and she told Maren that her son in California had just called to say he was getting divorced, and she had lain awake for many nights not knowing what to say to her boy. And Maren did not answer with advice, because she had learned long ago that her work was not to heal what belonged to someone else, but only to find it and name it gently enough for its owner to hold it themselves. She worked in silence for a while, letting her fingers speak the language words could not, easing the tight place in the shoulder blades, tracing the old knot in the lower back that Mrs. Ferreira had carried since she was young, and little by little Mrs. Ferreira relaxed beneath her hands, the way a body relaxes when someone has finally chosen to pay attention. Mrs. Ferreira said, when the session was nearly over, her voice much lighter than when she had arrived, that Maren read more in people than her own doctor did, and Maren could not even see her. Maren smiled and said what she always said, that it was precisely because she could not see that she had to notice other things, that eyes were skillful liars and people trusted them far too much, while a hand resting on a shoulder did not know how to lie. But even as she said it, the sentence she had spoken hundreds of times, her mind slipped away, slipped back to the sharp line of a jaw. Beneath her fingers in the darkness of the auction room, to the haunting cadence she still had not forgotten, and she realized, with a vague discomfort, that throughout the whole morning, even while her hands had been working on Mrs. Ferrera's body, some part of her had still been holding that stranger's heart and trying to understand it. After Mrs. Ferrera left, tucking a tip beneath the flower vase as she always did, despite Marin telling her many times it was not necessary, the room fell into the quiet of mid-morning, and Marin sat down in the chair by the window where sunlight warmed her cheek, and she let herself think about the things she had tried not to think about. She had read thousands of bodies in her life, had felt every kind of pain, pain fresh and hot, old pain fossilized into posture, the pain of people who had been strong for too long with no one allowing them to be weak. But no pain had ever clung to her the way the pain she had felt last night had, and she did not understand why. Perhaps, she thought, it was because of its scale, the sense that it had been there so long it had become landscape rather than event. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that made her sit straighter in the chair, it was because, for the first time in 3 years, she had met someone who carried his burden in exactly the same way she carried hers, hidden beneath a perfect layer of calm, and she did not know whether she would ever meet that man again, the man whose name she had not even had to ask before he had somehow told her. August, the name he had not spoken, the name only his silence had given her, and she sat there in the sunlight, a woman normally so good at letting go of what did not belong to her, this time finding herself unable to let go at all. Thaddeus Bonner had served this family for 30 years, and in those 30 years he had built for himself a complete dictionary of the moods of the man he called both boy and master, depending on the distance between them at any given moment. There was the cold anger, an anger with architecture and order, which signaled that someone would have to endure a very unpleasant conversation before morning. There was the thoughtful melancholy that arrived in cycles like weather, requiring a specific kind of liquor and a carefully measured solitude. There was the dry amusement, rare and precise, which Thad privately considered the most dangerous of all, because it meant his master was becoming interested in something, and interest was always the beginning of trouble. He had thought he knew every expression August Rail could wear on his face, had catalogued each one through 3 decades of standing at the edge of this man's life. But when he stepped into the study at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning and saw August standing by the window, one hand resting against the glass, looking down at the dark river below, he realized he was witnessing an expression he had no name for, and that, after 30 years, made him stop at the threshold. The only way Thad could describe it later, when he tried to explain it to himself in the privacy of his room, was interrupted. It was the face of a man who had been in the middle of one thought for years, and had just had someone walk across it, breaking its thread, leaving it suspended and unfinished. August did not hear him come in, or heard and did not bother to turn, and both possibilities were equally unusual, because this man had never allowed anything to enter the range of his hearing without marking it. Thad stood still, allowing the silence to become an invitation, a skill he had polished over 3 decades, and he waited. He was very good at waiting. At last he asked gently and carefully whether something had happened at the auction, sir, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned that with this man, questions had to be set down as lightly as placing an object on water, or else they would sink. August did not turn back at once. His hand remained on the glass, and Thad saw his fingers close slightly, a gesture so small perhaps, no one but he would have noticed. He who had spent half his life reading this man's smallest movements in order to sense storms before they arrived. August said there had been a woman, and his voice carried a quality Thad had never heard before, not anger, not melancholy, not dry amusement, but something more exposed, as if the outer varnish had been scraped away to reveal the raw wood beneath. She had fallen into him in the crowd. She was blind, Thad. She had reached out to keep herself from falling, and her hand had landed on his chest, and she had stood there for a mere fleeting moment. He stopped, and Thad waited, because there was always more, always more. August went on to say that she had told him he was in pain. She had said he was hiding it. Thad did not move, but inside him something went completely still, because he knew exactly what August was speaking of. He had suspected it for years, and had never dared ask directly, the way August sometimes lifted a hand to his chest, and then lowered it as if changing his mind, the way he sometimes paused on the stairs longer than a healthy man needed to pause, the brief pallor he always concealed so skillfully that Thad had convinced himself he must have imagined it. Thad repeated those words in pain and heard how dry his own voice had become. August finally turned from the window, and in the dim light of the only desk lamp still burning, Thad saw the dark eyes of the man he had served for nearly his entire life. And in those eyes there was none of the familiar defense, none of the familiar wall, only a bewilderment Thad had not seen since that very distant night, when August had still been a young man who had just understood what he would have to carry. August said softly, almost to himself, that she had read it, Thad. In 30 seconds, a complete stranger had read the very thing he had buried for 6 years, and had never told anyone, not even him, and Thad, the man who had waded through the collapse of empires, stood there in the study and felt, for the first time in a very long while, that the ground beneath his feet had shifted ever so slightly, like the first stones beginning to slide down a mountainside. It took Thad a moment to recover the calm professional voice that had followed him through 3 decades, and when he did what he had always done whenever the ground shifted. He turned bewilderment into information, because information could be managed, information had structure, and he could build a response from information, even when he could not yet see the shape of the thing he was responding to. He said, "Sir," then stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind him, telling August that he needed him to think about this clearly, and he knew that was difficult at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. If a complete stranger could read his condition, with only one touch, then the first question was not how she had done it, but who else could do it, and what would happen if she had been sent. August did not answer at once, and Thad used that silence to say what he truly feared, the thing that had tightened his stomach from the moment. August spoke the words 30 seconds. For months now, reporters had been circling the harbor investigation, and August knew as well as he did that after the spring indictment, the federal side was looking for any way to place someone close to him. A physical weakness, if it got out, would not be only a matter of his health. It would be the thing every enemy he had been waiting for over many years. It would be the first crack in a wall they had spent a lifetime building, and a woman suddenly falling into him in the middle of a crowd and accidentally reading the most dangerous thing about him. "Sir, with all due respect," did not sound like a coincidence. August listened to all of it, and when he answered, his voice had regained control, but Thad could hear that it was working harder than usual to keep that control in place. He said no, with absolute and immediate certainty. No, Thad. She had not been sent. He had been in that room with her. He had heard the way she spoke. No one could act that stillness, that complete absence of calculation. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman lost in a crowd, with hands far too skilled and no real understanding of appropriate caution. But even as he said it, August recognized the irony in it, that his certainty itself was what disturbed him most, because he was not the sort of man who trusted a complete stranger on a whim. He had not allowed himself that luxury throughout his adult life, and now he was standing in his own study defending a stranger, with a conviction he could not explain even to himself. Thad replied that if she was as harmless as August said, then confirming that would cost them nothing but a little time, and it would let both of them sleep easier. But if Thad was wrong and August was right, then he still wanted to know exactly whom they were trusting. August was silent for a long while, looking down at his own hand, the hand that still held the memory of where her palm had rested. Then he nodded, very faintly. He said public records only. He did not want anything invasive. No watching her private life, no listening in, no touching the people around her. Her name, her profession, anything anyone could look up. He wanted to know who she was, not dig into her. Thad nodded, noting both the order and the unusual boundary August had drawn around it, then stepped out into the hallway, where Renzo Kovac was leaning against the wall with the patient look of a man accustomed to waiting, while historical events unfolded, phone in hand, expression unchanged. Thad said there was a background search request. Quiet. A woman named Maren Calloway, piano tuner, living in the city. Everything that could be found without approaching her. Renzo looked up, and something moved in his eyes, though his face remained flat as usual. He asked if it was that kind of thing again. Thad did not ask what that kind meant, because he knew exactly what it meant. He told him to search thoroughly and turned away, but he still heard Renzo mutter behind him, in a low but distinctly audible murmur, that he would bet $50 the boss would go looking for the girl himself within a month. and Thad did not turn back, but privately thought, with weary resignation, that it was a wager he would be foolish to take. After Thad left, August remained alone in the study, and he did not sit down, did not pour a drink, did not do any of the small rituals he usually used to fill the hours when he could not sleep. He only stood by the window looking at the river and let his mind go back to a place it rarely allowed itself to go. He was 34 years old, and he had been running this organization for 8 years, ever since the night his father collapsed in the very chair no one now sat in anymore, and people handed him the kingdom of the docks in silent agreements, as though placing a coat too heavy over the shoulders of someone who had never asked for it. He accepted it, because in his father's world, people did not refuse. They either carried what was given to them or disappeared, and August had chosen to carry it, had learned how to wear that heavy coat until it fit him so well, he could no longer remember the shape of himself before he put it on. But there was a life before that coat, a part of his life he kept locked in a place inside him, where even Thad was not allowed to enter, and that was his mother. She had been a pianist, a woman whose hands knew how to do what no power his father possessed could ever do, turn air into something that made people stop breathing. And he still remembered, though he had tried to forget for many years, the feeling of lying on the wooden floor as a boy and listening to her play in the late afternoons, the way music filled the house until even the darkness softened. Then she died, when he was already grown, old enough to understand that what he had lost was not only a person, but the only part of that house that had ever known how to be gentle. And with her, music left that home and never returned. Her piano, a Bosendorfer his father had sold in some fit of anger, August had never fully understood, had passed through many hands for 10 years, and 10 days ago, through an intermediary whom August paid, so no one would know the true name behind the purchase. He tracked it down and bought it back at that private auction, not to play it, because he had never learned, and his fingers only knew how to do the things his world demanded, but for a reason he would not allow himself to name, a longing to keep within, reach the last remaining piece of a life he had lost. He had not meant to attend that preview evening, had not meant to let himself stand in the same room as the piano, because he knew he was not brave enough yet to hear it sound, to hear the music that would pull him back down to the wooden floor of childhood, and to the woman whose hands had long since fallen silent. But he had gone, and because he had gone, a blind woman had fallen into him, and read the thing that no music, no power, no control of his had ever been able to hide, because there was another secret too, deeper even than the pain of losing his mother, a secret that belonged to his own body. 6 years earlier, after the first time he collapsed without knowing why, in the middle of a meeting where the truth, if exposed, would have meant he would not have lived until today, he had summoned a doctor, one man only, chosen more for discretion than skill, and that doctor had pressed a stethoscope to his chest, listened for a long time, then told him the thing August had carried ever since like a sentence, that his heart had a congenital defect, that something in its rhythm had been wrong since the day he was born, and was quietly growing worse with each passing year. He listened to all of it, did not ask how much time he had left, and the only thing he said to that doctor, in the low voice no one dared defy, was that not one word of it was to be written down, no records, no papers, not a single trace anywhere in the world, proving that August Rail's heart could not be trusted, because in his world, a truth written down was a truth that could be stolen. And he had lived the next 6 years believing that as long as no one knew, he was still safe, until tonight, when a stranger's hand rested on his chest, and that belief shattered like glass. The call came to Marin's workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after the night at the auction house, and the caller introduced himself as the butler of a private residence in the Garden District. An older man's voice, courteous and precise down to every syllable, saying that his employer had a piano in need of care from someone with exceptional skill, that he had heard very high praise of her, and that if she agreed, a car would come for her on Thursday afternoon. Marin held the phone and stayed silent for a beat longer than necessary, because there was something in this offer that made the hairs on her arms lift faintly, not quite caution but a premonition, the instinct of someone who had learned to trust the signals other people ignored. And she wondered, though she had no reason to wonder, whether she already knew whose house it was even before she set foot inside it. She accepted. She told herself it was because of the work, because a piano that needed tuning was always a piano worth answering. But deep down, she knew the real reason was not entirely the piano. On Thursday afternoon, the car took her along the oak-shaded streets of the Garden District, where the air was thick with magnolia and the damp scent of houses that had stood there for more than a century. When she crossed the threshold of the mansion, she read its scale at once, by the way sound fell through the high-ceilinged rooms, by the echoes that told her of wide spaces and hardwood floors polished through generations. But the thing she noticed most was not the house, it was him. She felt him before he spoke, the shift in the air, the slight drop in the room's temperature, the particular quality of attention when it had mass and weight and was focused strongly enough. And she knew he was there, standing only a few steps away, before she could have explained how she knew. He thanked her for coming, Miss Calloway. And that voice, that low, dense voice, carrying the weight of years, the one she had not been able to forget for 10 days, confirmed what some part of her had known from the moment she received the call. She said it was him, not as a question, that it was his piano that needed tuning. She heard a brief silence, the silence of someone who had just been read correctly for the second time. And then he answered, and she thought she heard something almost like embarrassment, very carefully concealed in his voice. He said he had a piano in the music room, that it had not been played in a long time, and he had been told she was the best person in the city at waking pianos that had slept too long. He did not mention the night at the auction house, did not mention her hand on his chest or the things she had said, and Maren understood that both of them were pretending together, that this was only a work appointment, a polite pretense she was willing to join, at least for now. "Then take me to it," she said, and as she followed him through the halls of the house, she realized something that surprised her. He knew how to walk with a blind person. He did not take her by the elbow, did not pull her, did not do what almost everyone did the first time, that instinctive act of holding her as if she were something fragile and steering her along. He simply moved beside her, at exactly the pace she chose, half a step ahead, so that the movement of air from his body became a signal she could follow. And when there was a step, he only said softly that there was one down, exactly 2 steps before she reached it, no earlier and no later, the precise amount of time a person needed to adjust. Maren walked beside him in silence, reading that subtlety, that understanding most people had to learn after many mistakes, and that he seemed to know already. And she wondered where this man had learned it, beside whom in his life he had learned how to let another person keep their dignity even when they could not see the path ahead. And she did not ask, but she tucked that question away, with all the other things she was slowly gathering about August Rail, the man who hid a damaged heart and a house full of silent rooms. The music room lay at the end of a long hallway, and the moment Maren stepped inside, she knew the piano here immediately. It was the exact same Bosendorfer from the auction house, now resting in his home. When she set her hand on the lid, she let her fingers travel once across the keys, recognizing the precise tension she had restored to its strings just 10 days ago, though it now carried the scent of a room that had been closed for years. She said almost to herself that this piano was sad, and she felt him stop behind her, silent and listening. Not broken, only forgotten. There was a difference. A broken piano needed repair, but a forgotten piano only needed someone to come back to it. She sat down on the bench and began to work, opening her tool case, letting her fingers find the tuning pins, and as she worked, she spoke, not to fill the emptiness, but because he had asked, in a voice carrying the weight of real attention, what her work truly was. She said wood remembered everything. It remembered the humidity of every season. It remembered the person who had played it, and it remembered the heavy shroud of its recent isolation. When she tuned a piano, she did not impose a pitch upon it. She listened for where it wanted to return, then helped it get there. The tension in a string was like the tension in a person. It told a story if one knew how to place a hand on it and stay silent long enough to listen. She felt him move a little closer, and she went on, because somewhere in the past 10 days she had decided she would be honest with this man. That was why she had read him that night. She had done this work all her life, with wood and with people, and over time, her touch had developed an absolute intuition for both. She could perceive the exact strain locked within the material, knowing that the body recorded what the mind tried to release. Pain lived in the shoulders, old fear gathered at the nape of the neck, and something carried too long became part of the structure. no longer a wound but the frame itself. He was silent for a long while after that, and when he spoke, his voice had changed, one layer of defense stripped away. He told her he had looked her up after the night at the auction house, that he had needed to know who she was. Maren paused with her hand on a tuning pin, not because she was angry, but because his honesty startled her. She let the sentence settle, then asked calmly what he had found. And he answered, and she noticed that he chose his words carefully, as though the boundary he had set mattered to him just as much as the information. He said public records only, her name, her profession, the address of her workshop. He had gone no further than that. He wanted her to know it. There was something in the way he emphasized that boundary that made Maren believe him, and she nodded slowly, continuing her work. She asked whether he had read the reviews from her clients, and she thought she heard something in his breath that was almost a smile. He said yes. They were very good. One person had written that she found the thing they had stopped listening for. Maren smiled, lowering her face toward the strings so he would not see it, though she knew he still did, and she worked for a while longer in a silence that had become strangely comfortable, a silence that was full rather than empty. When she had finished checking the entire piano, she closed the lid and told him the truth she had known from the beginning, that a piano moved to a new environment after years of silence could not settle in just one session. The wood needed time to become accustomed to the humidity of this house and the tension of transport, and she would have to return several more times before she could bring it back to where it belonged. He said, then she would come back, and it was not quite a question, but the voice of something already decided, and Maren stood, found her cane, and before she could consider whether she should say it aloud, she said yes. She would come back, and in the silence that followed, she heard that both of them knew the rhythm of return just established was not entirely because of the piano. As Maren was preparing to leave, he asked her, in the cautious voice of someone unaccustomed to offering invitations, whether she would like to walk through the garden before the car took her home. Because the afternoon had softened, and the air outside was fresher than it was indoors, and Maren, who would have refused anyone else because it was late and she still had a long way to go, found herself nodding. The garden behind the mansion was wide and old, and she read that the moment she stepped outside, through the way the sound of the city retreated behind the brick walls, through the rustle of oak leaves overhead, and the drip of water somewhere from an old fountain, through the smell of damp earth and night, jasmine beginning to open as the light faded. He walked beside her along the stone path, still with that subtle care she had noticed, matching her pace without ever making it seem as though he was matching it, and they walked for a while in silence. The kind of silence she was beginning to understand was not emptiness to him, but something with its own texture. She asked whether he had lived here long, and he answered that he had been born in this house, that the stones beneath their feet had been laid by hands from a century ago, and he spoke of it with the familiarity of ownership, but not the crude kind of ownership, rather the kind that belonged to someone who had remained in a place so long its history had become private, rather than something found in books. He described to her a magnolia tree, he said, had stood there since before he was born, and a corner of the wall where something else had once been. And Maren listened not only to his words but also to what lay beneath them, and what she heard made her slow her steps. Because for the first time, not through her hand resting on his chest, but through his own voice, through the way he spoke about a vast house as though it were empty, she sensed his loneliness, and it was larger than she had imagined, larger even than the stumbling heartbeat that had first told her. It was not the loneliness of a man without friends or without people around him. She knew he had a whole mansion full of servants and guards and advisors. It was a loneliness deeper than that, the loneliness of a man standing in the middle of a crowd that belonged to him, while not one of them was allowed to know who he truly was, the loneliness of a man who had spent years building such perfect control that now he was imprisoned inside it, a great house with countless rooms, whose doors he had locked so long ago that he had forgotten how to open them. She said softly that this house was too large for one person, her voice dropping into that quiet, unadorned frequency she usually reserved for the moments just before a tensed muscle finally surrendered. She didn't offer it as sympathy, but as a map of the room they were both trapped in, and she felt him stop beside her on the stone path, felt the quality of his silence change, tightening slightly, the tension of someone who had just been seen in a place where they had not thought anyone could look. After a while, he answered that it had always been this large, his voice deeper, quieter, as if the layer of control had thinned by a single thread. He had simply stopped noticing its size a long time ago. Maren did not answer that, because she understood that some truths needed to be left alone right after they were spoken, not filled with comfort or advice, only witnessed. And she stood beside him in the darkening garden, two strangers carrying similar burdens in different ways. And she heard the small dripping of the fountain and the night jasmine, and the breathing of the man beside her, a breath in which she could now hear the effort hidden inside it. And she thought that perhaps this was what she could give him. Not healing, because she did not have the power to heal something so large, but simply attention, the plain truth of another person truly being there, truly listening, in a garden where no one had walked beside him in a very long time. The report Renzo placed on August's desk a few days later was meticulous and ordinary in every important way, and extraordinary in the one way no one had expected. Maren Calloway, 27 years old, born in Savannah, had moved to New Orleans at 19 to study at the conservatory, where she had once been considered a pianist of great promise, one of those students professors spoke of in the tone people reserve for rare gifts. Then there had been the fire, 3 years earlier, a fire that broke out in the old apartment building where she lived, caused by an electrical fault in a building long overdue for repairs, not the specific fault of any one person, the kind of accident so ordinary in its mechanics and so catastrophic in its consequences that it refused to carry any meaning at all. The flames had taken her sight, and they had taken more than that. They had taken her twin sister, Della Calloway, her constant shadow in life, a grown woman who, from what Renzo had found, had been deeply close to her, almost inseparable. August read that line twice, then 3 times, and felt something inside his chest tighten, not the familiar broken rhythm, but something else, a recognition. She had no family left in New Orleans. Her parents had died before that, leaving only a few distant relatives in Georgia, with whom she rarely kept in touch. She lived with a friend named Josie in the Marigny. She had no connection to any organization, no ties to the press, no link to any investigative agency, not one relationship that could make her a piece in anyone's hand. Renzo had checked thoroughly, had even followed the name of the reporter Thad had been worried about, and there was nothing, not a single thread tying Maren Calloway to the world August lived in. She went where pianos needed tuning because that was her profession, and she did it so well that people wrote things about her that people rarely wrote about a tradesperson. There was one review, left by a client who had signed only with an initial, that Renzo had printed and underlined, and August read it more times than any other line. The words felt heavy with a quiet truth, capturing an intimacy he hadn't realized he was craving. He set the report down, then he picked it up and read it again. He was searching, and Thad understood that as he stood quietly on the other side of the desk, searching for the thing that would explain this situation in manageable terms, the hidden connection, the strategic motive, the angle. Because those things were easy to understand, those things had countermeasures. Those things fit neatly into the architecture of a world he had spent his whole life learning how to navigate. But there was no angle, no hidden motive, no faction, no hand-pulling strings. There was only a woman who had lost everything on an ordinary November night and had rebuilt herself from those ashes into something precise and enduring. A woman who had reached out in a crowd and accidentally touched him and had paid more attention to him in 30 seconds than anyone had paid to him in most of a decade. Thad said she had no connection to anything, though it was unnecessary, only to break the silence. August answered that he could read that much, his voice low. Then he sat for a long time with the report before him, and he thought about the thing none of its lines recorded but that he had felt in the dark garden that night, that this woman was carrying a burden like his, the burden of a survivor, of the one who remained when someone else did not. And he realized that the thing that had allowed her to read him so quickly was not a skill, but an understanding, the kind of understanding that comes only to people who have walked through some version of the same darkness themselves. And for the first time, August wondered, not what kind of threat she might be to him, but what he might be to her. But the report on Maren was not the only thing Renzo brought that week, and the second thing he brought was not peaceful at all. He waited until Thad had left the room before placing a set of photographs and a page of notes in front of August, and he said in his characteristically flat voice, the voice August had learned meant the flatter it sounded. The worse the news was, that while keeping watch from a distance to make sure Maren was exactly what she appeared to be, he had noticed something he did not like at all. Someone else was watching her too. Renzo said the man's name was Silas Drew, a man of the Solaire house. He recognized him because he had seen him at the harbor negotiation last month, standing behind old Solaire like a shadow. For the past 3 days he had been lingering around the Marigny, around Miss Calloway's workshop. He had not approached her, he had only watched. And a man like Silas Drew did not watch a blind piano tuner unless someone was paying him to do it. August sat very still, and inside him something went cold and sharpened. The part of him forged through 8 years of running a world where every movement had meaning. The Solaire house controlled the western docks, and they had coveted August's share for years, had waited for a crack, a moment of weakness, an excuse, and the only question worth asking now was why they were watching Maren, a woman who had nothing to do with the docks or the agreements or anything in his world. Then he understood, and that understanding turned his blood cold, because there was only one reason the Solaire house would care about the woman who had placed her hand on his chest in the middle of a crowd. They knew, or they suspected. Somehow, a rumor about August's heart had begun to leak, and if the Solaire house had heard even a whisper that there was a woman who had accidentally read his fatal weakness, then they would want that woman, either to draw from her what she knew, or to use her as leverage against him. August asked how they could have known, his voice so low Renzo had to lean closer. No one knew Renzo. He had made certain of that for 6 years. Renzo was silent for a while, then said the thing they were both thinking. Someone knew. Someone had always known, sir, no matter how careful August had been. A truth like this did not leak by itself. There was a mouth somewhere, and he would find it, but the trail he had followed so far was faint. It did not point to an enemy. It pointed to someone who had once been close enough to know, close enough to hear what no one should have heard. August sat with that, feeling his damaged heartbeat quicken in his chest, the bodily response he hated most because it was the very thing betraying him. And he thought of Maren in her workshop, a blind woman who had no idea that simply because she had happened to touch the right man on the right night, she had now been pulled into a world where she had no weapons to defend herself. And in that moment, August Rail made a decision he would later understand as the point where everything began to change, because he did not order the threat handled the way he had always handled every threat, did not calculate how to use her as bait, or how to cut contact with her to protect himself. He told Renzo to put people on her, discreetly. He did not want her to know. He did not want her frightened or feeling watched. But if Silas Drew or anyone from the Solaire house came close to her within a distance he did not like, he wanted to know before she even had time to hear the footsteps. Renzo looked at his boss for a long while, and there was something in his eyes, not exactly surprise, but the confirmation of a man who had just won a wager he had placed in advance. And he nodded, gathered the photographs, and before leaving the room, stopped at the threshold and said softly enough that he could deny it but loudly enough for August to hear, that he would put his 2 best people on the girl, and that his boss should ask himself why he was willing to reveal so much, just to protect someone he had only met twice. The meeting took place on a damp morning in an empty warehouse near the harbor, the sort of neutral location both sides accepted because neither side owned it, and August arrived exactly on time as he always did, not 1 minute early to appear eager, not 1 minute late to appear contemptuous, because in his world, even the moment a man crossed a threshold was a statement. On the surface, the negotiation was about shipping routes and boundaries that had been violated, but August knew, as he always knew, that the words spoken were only the surface, and what truly mattered was happening beneath them, in the silences and the glances and the way old Solaire leaned back in his chair, with the smugness of a man who believed he had just gained a new card to play. And standing behind him, silent, was Silas Drew. August did not look directly at him, but he knew exactly where he stood, the way a man always knows the location of a knife in the room, and he felt Drew's eyes on him throughout the meeting, not the gaze of a bodyguard watching a threat, but the gaze of someone searching for something specific, waiting for a sign. And August understood, with a certainty that left his palms cold. that Drew was waiting for his heart to betray him. He was waiting for the moment August lifted a hand to his chest, or paused longer than necessary when rising, or revealed even one fleeting trace of the pallor he had hidden so skillfully for 6 years that he had almost convinced himself it did not exist. This was exactly why he had never let anyone know. This was the nightmare he had lived trying to avoid, because in this room, among people trained all their lives to scent weakness the way sharks scent blood, a damaged heart was not a medical condition. It was a sentence. It was the moment the entire structure of power he had carried on his shoulders for 8 years would collapse. Because in this world, people did not follow a dying man. They tore him apart. So August sat with absolute stillness, controlling every breath, every rhythm, forcing his treacherous body into silence by pure will, and he answered old Solaire in a low, steady voice that did not waver, parrying each of the man's moves, yielding not 1 inch of the boundary Solaire had come to test. And all the while he felt his own heartbeats stumble and race and falter beneath his tailored suit, a small storm no one in the room was allowed to hear. When the meeting ended with neither side gaining what it wanted, as such meetings always did, old Solaire stood and said something that seemed harmless, that he had heard August had been working too hard lately, that a man in his position should take care of his health, and he said it with a thin smile. And August understood exactly what it was. It was not concern. It was a probe, a stone dropped into a well to hear how far it fell. August did not blink. He answered that he had never been healthier, in a voice so calm even he almost believed it, and he saw a flicker of disappointment pass through Solaire's eyes, the disappointment of a man who had cast a line and caught nothing. But he also saw, behind him, Silas Drew tilt his head slightly, a gesture so small August read it like a line of text, and it said they had no proof yet, but they believed. And once the Solaire house believed something, they would not stop until they had something harder than rumor in their hands. On the drive back, sitting silently in the car as the river slid past outside the window, August thought of Marin, of the fact that she was the only link in the world that could confirm the thing the Solaire house was searching for. And he understood that simply by existing, simply by having accidentally touched him, she had become the most dangerous thing to him, and also the thing he most needed to protect, and those two truths, for the first time in his life, did not contradict each other at all. And so the weeks passed in a rhythm neither of them admitted aloud, yet both of them began to live by. Marin came in the afternoons to work on the piano in the music room, and beneath her hands, that piano slowly returned to itself, 1 string at a time, 1 session at a time, but both of them knew the piano had long since stopped being the true reason. Every session ended the same way. She would close the lid, and instead of calling for the car right away, she would linger, and somehow her hands, the hands that had spent a lifetime reading tension in wood and in people, began to find the tight places in his body. At first she did not ask permission. She simply did it, placing her hands at the back of his neck, where she had felt the gathered strain of a man who had stood in command too long, with too few people brave enough to tell him no, and he, a man who had never allowed anyone to touch him without purpose, found no reason to stop her. She never spoke much while she worked, and neither did he, but in those silences something was given and received without needing words, and gradually, week after week, she read more and more of him, not his secrets, because those she already knew, but the layers beneath them, the way his loneliness had hardened into a posture, the way he held his shoulders, as though he was always preparing to take a blow, the way even when he sat still he was never truly at rest, because rest was a luxury his world did not allow. And through those many afternoons, she realized she was reading in his body a version of the very thing she carried in her own, the constant vigilance of someone who had once lost everything in a single moment and had never again allowed herself to believe that the ground beneath her feet was solid. As for August, he lived those weeks in a state he had no experience understanding, because for the first time in many years, he looked forward to something. He found himself glancing at the clock on Thursday afternoons, found himself noticing the quality of the silence in the house before she arrived. Compared with after she had gone, and with a surprise almost uncomfortable in its sharpness, he realized that the tension she eased in his body was not only the tension of muscle, but something deeper, the tension of carrying a truth alone for 6 years, and each time her hands rested on him, that burden grew a little lighter, not because it had been solved, but because for the first time it had been shared, witnessed by another person who knew enough to understand its weight. One afternoon, while her hands were resting on his shoulders and both of them were silent, he noticed that he had stopped controlling his breathing when he was with her, that somewhere in those weeks he had stopped bracing himself to hide the stumbling rhythm of his heart when she was in the room, because she already knew, and that simple truth, that there was one person in the world before whom he did not have to pretend, was a luxury so rare he almost did not dare believe it was real. And Maren, with her hands resting over the chest she had come to know so well, felt that the life within it was still struggling, still rebelling against its own confinement as it had on the first night. But she also felt something else, something for which she had not yet found a name. The difference between pain carried alone and pain carried together, and she knew, though she had not yet said it even to herself, that she had crossed a boundary she had no intention of crossing back. It happened on an afternoon no different from any other, and perhaps that was why it caught them both so completely unprepared. Maren had just finished tuning a difficult passage on the piano and was putting away her tools, and August rose from the chair by the window where he always sat listening to her work. And in the moment he stood, Maren heard it. A change in his breathing, an inhale cut short, and then the sound of his footsteps, stopping halfway in the way a body only stops when something inside it has suddenly gone wrong. She set down her tool case and moved toward him before her mind had even told her to do so, her hands finding him, one hand on his arm, the other on his chest, and the heartbeat she had come to know by heart was now hammering wildly beneath her palm, a chaotic, fracturing cadence that felt dangerously close to giving out entirely, not just fleeing from itself this time, but breaking. She told him to sit down, and her voice was not panicked, not trembling, but calm and certain in the way of someone who had spent years staying steady, in moments when other people broke apart, and she felt him resist for 1 second, the lifelong reflex of a man who never let anyone see him fall. Then she said again, more softly, "August, sit down. There's no one here but me." And perhaps because she had spoken his name, or perhaps because of that last sentence, "There's no one here but me," he stopped fighting, and he let her guide him down to the floor right there, with his back against the leg of the chair, because the floor was closer and safer than the chair, and she knelt beside him, one hand still on his chest, reading that panicked rhythm. She told him to breathe with her. "Don't try to control it. Don't fight it. Just breathe and let me count." Then she began to count, slowly, evenly, in the low voice she used to bring clients stiffened by pain back to their breath, and she felt him try to hold on to the rhythm of her counting like a drowning man clutching a rope, and little by little, so slowly it was almost impossible to notice, the frantic heart beneath her hand began to ease. The trapped bird stopped thrashing, the beat still damaged, still uneven, but no longer running away. They sat like that on the music room floor for a long while after the danger had passed, he leaning against the chair leg with his eyes closed, she kneeling beside him with her hand still resting on his chest. And in that silence something had changed forever between them, and they both knew it, though neither of them said it aloud. Because this was something August had never allowed to happen in 6 years. Not once, not with Thad, not with a doctor, not with anyone alive. He had never let another person witness the moment his heart betrayed him, because in his world, to be seen in weakness meant death, and now he had just let a blind woman kneel on his floor and hold him through the worst of it. And the astonishing thing was not that he had allowed it to happen, but that he was still alive. The danger had passed and he was still here, and the sky had not fallen, and the woman beside him had not turned his weakness into a weapon. She was only there, simply there. At last she softly asked how long, and he understood what she was asking. Not how long this episode had lasted, but how long he had lived with this, and he opened his mouth to say the lie he had told all his life, that it was nothing, that he was fine. But the sentence could not come out, because her hand was still resting over the heart that had just betrayed him, and she would know at once that it was a lie. So instead, he said it had been a long time, and those words fell into the silence like 2 stones dropped into a very deep well. And it was the first time in 6 years. August Rail had spoken the truth about his heart aloud, to the only woman in the world, who had forced him to do so simply by refusing to leave. A while later, he had enough strength to move from the floor to the armchair, and Maren sat down in the chair across from him, and this time she did not place her hands on him, because she sensed that what needed to happen next did not belong to hands but to words, and she had learned long ago that there were moments when touch would fill a silence that needed to remain open so words could find their way out. They sat in the fading afternoon light, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then August spoke, and his voice was nothing like usual, stripped of the thick layer of authority he always wore, leaving only a tired man in a darkening room. He said he had forgotten what it felt like to be tired. Not tired in the body, a different kind of tired. The exhaustion of having to be strong every hour of every day for years, without being allowed to stop for even a moment, because in his world, the moment you stopped was the moment you were swallowed. He was not allowed to be sick. He was not allowed to be afraid. He was not allowed to let anyone see that beneath all of this, he was only a body slowly failing, like every other body. Maren listened, and when she answered, she did not offer comfort, she offered something truer than that. She said softly that she knew that exhaustion. Not exactly the same as his, but she knew its shape. After the fire, after she lost Della and lost her eyes too, the people around her needed her to be all right. They needed her to be strong, needed her to overcome it, needed her to become the beautiful story of the blind woman who rebuilt her life, because if she collapsed, they would have to look directly at the terrible thing that had happened, and no one wanted to look at it. So she was strong, she survived. But no one had ever asked whether she was allowed to stop, and she had never allowed herself to ask that question either. Survivors aren't allowed to stop. They're only allowed to keep surviving. That sentence hung in the air between them, and August realized she had just named something he had carried for 6 years, without ever finding words for it, the prison of having to be strong, and he looked at the woman sitting across from him in the darkness, the woman who had gone through a version of the same hell and come out not whole, but enduring, with the kind of endurance fire leaves behind after it has taken everything else, and he felt something inside him wanting to tell her more than he had ever told anyone. He said there was an option, slowly, groping for the words as if walking on thin ice, an option he had avoided for 6 years. There was something he could do for this heart, something the doctor had told him about long ago. But the price of it was something he could not pay, something that would require him to vanish from his world, long enough for that world to tear him apart, so he had chosen to do nothing. He had chosen to continue like this, controlling it, hiding it until it killed him. He had told himself that was the braver choice. He stopped, and in the darkness Maren heard him draw in a soft breath. But sitting here tonight, after she had just seen him like that, he was no longer sure it was courage. He was beginning to think perhaps it was only a slow way of dying that he had given a more beautiful name. Maren did not answer at once, because she understood the weight of what he had just said, understood that he had opened a door he had kept shut for 6 years, and she did not want to shove it wide with a hasty reply. At last she told him he did not have to decide that tonight, but she was glad he had spoken it aloud. The things we hide in the dark always seem larger and more inescapable than they really are. Sometimes simply saying a thing out loud is enough to begin seeing that it can be chosen differently, and they sat together in the room that had gone completely dark. 2 people the world had demanded be strong alone, no longer having to be strong alone for the first time. The next afternoon when she came, something had changed in the air between them, a new honesty born from that night, and while she was working on the back of his neck, easing the familiar tightness there, he said without turning around, in the voice of a man who had decided it was time, that she should know who he was, Maren, who he truly was, before she let herself go any farther into whatever was happening here. Her hands did not stop. She kept working, her fingers moving steadily along the band of muscle at his shoulder, and she said calmly, "Then tell me." And he did. He did not give details, did not tell her specific things that would turn her into the keeper of a dangerous burden, but he said enough for her to understand the shape of his life. He spoke of inheriting an organization from his father, a network that controlled the docks and the things that moved through them, agreements that operated in the darkness beneath the city everyone else saw under sunlight. He told her he was the kind of man whose name people lowered their voices to say, that things had been done in his name that he was not proud of, that his hands were not clean, and had not been clean since the day he put on that coat that was far too heavy. He said his world worked by brutal rules no one outside could see, that loyalty was bought more often with fear than with affection. that he had spent 8 years living in a place where no one could be trusted completely, and that very world was the reason his damaged heart had to be kept secret at any cost, because where he lived, people did not pity the weak. They tore them apart. He said all of this in the even voice of a man laying the truth on the table and waiting for the reaction he was certain would come, the reaction he had seen on the faces of everyone who had ever known enough about him, the retreat, the fear, the moment people realized they were standing close to something dangerous and began calculating their way back. And through all of it, Marin's hands did not stop. They continued their work, steady, patient, reading the tension in his body and loosening it little by little. And when he finished, when silence had finally filled the room, she did not pull her hands away, did not stand, did not do any of the things he had prepared himself to receive. She only continued for a little while longer, then said, in that matter-of-fact voice he had begun to treasure, that she knew he was not a good man, in the simple way people usually used that word. She had known that from the first night, even before she knew the details. People did not carry the kind of pain he carried unless they had done and witnessed things that left that kind of pain behind. She stopped moving her hands, not to withdraw them, but to place both palms flat against his shoulders, a gesture of presence rather than work. She was not here to judge the life he had lived. She did not have the right, and it was not her place. She was here because what she had felt beneath her hands that first night was real, and it was still real, and a human being carrying real pain deserved to have another person see it, no matter what that person had done. August sat very still beneath her hands, and he realized that in 8 years of running an empire built on fear, this was the first time anyone had looked straight at the darkest part of him and not run away. A week passed, then another, and the piano in the music room had now almost completely returned to itself, so much so that Marin knew there were only 1 or 2 more sessions left before her official work here would be finished. And both of them were aware of it without either one mentioning it, the awareness of an excuse running out. On a lightly rainy afternoon, when she had just finished and was sitting with him in the music room, he told her the last thing he had still kept back, the truth about his body that she had felt but had never heard him fully confirm. He said that the thing she had felt on the first night, his heart, was not stress, not overwork, not anything that could be cured with rest. He had been born with it, a defect in its very structure, something that had been wrong before he had even drawn his first breath, and for the past 6 years it had been quietly growing worse. The doctor had not told him how much time he had left, and he had not asked, but he could feel it, the way people feel winter coming before the snow falls. He was running out of time, Marin, and he had lived for 6 years with that knowledge without ever speaking it aloud to anyone. Marin received that in silence, and she did not pretend to be surprised, because some part of her had known from the very first touch that this rhythm was not something ordinary methods could heal. Then he continued, and his voice changed, lowered, carrying a shade she had never heard before, a wounded tenderness. There was something else she should know, and he had only just fully understood it. The piano at the auction house, the night she fell into him. The Bosendorfer she had been hired to tune. He stopped, and she heard him swallow. "It belonged to my mother," he whispered, revealing the connection he had hidden from the world. He confessed that he had bought it back at that auction, and had it brought straight to this mansion, but he had never dared to hear it sound, paralyzed by the memories of the music that left his home when she died. He had reclaimed his mother's past, yet lacked the courage to listen to it, and on that same night, the woman making it sing again had become the only person in the world who could hear his heart. That coincidence settled between them, too large to call random and too real to call fate, and Marin sat with it for a long while, feeling the invisible thread that had tied the two of them together, even before they ever touched. Then she asked softly the question she had carried in her heart for weeks. That pain, August. The pain she felt beneath her hands. Could it be eased? And she went on before he could answer, because she wanted him to understand exactly what she was asking. His heart was not something she could cure. Her hands could loosen the muscles around it, could help him breathe, could carry him through an episode like the one the other night, but they could not repair what was broken inside. That belonged to surgery, to medicine, to things beyond her hands. But the pain she was speaking of did not live only inside the heart. Much of it lived in the fact that he had carried it alone for 6 years. And that part, That lonely part did not need surgery. It needed only one thing, not to be carried alone anymore. And that was something she could give. She found his hand in the space between their two chairs and held it. That was something she was already giving him. They sat together in the silence that followed, and Maren felt that he had just given her his deepest secret, and that the balance between them demanded that she give something of herself in return, something she had never told anyone since it happened. She said softly that she had never told anyone this either. About Della, about that night, she told people the short version, the version they could bear, that there had been a fire, that she had lost her sight, that she had lost her sister, that she had rebuilt her life. But she had never told the true part. She stopped, and August did not rush her, only sat in the darkness, listening in that complete way he had of listening. And she went on. They were twins, but Della had always been the brighter one. She played better than Maren, laughed louder than Maren, lived larger than Maren. That night they had switched rooms, a trivial thing. Della had wanted the room with the window facing the street, because she was waiting for a call, and the signal was better there, so they switched. Just a small thing like that. And when the fire broke out in the night, it broke out on the side of the building where Maren should have been, and Della was there in her place. She said this not with tears, because the tears had long since run dry, but with the healed calm of an old wound that had learned how to live inside the flesh. For 3 years she had carried the thought that it should have been her, that her sister had died in her place, that she was breathing breaths that should have belonged to Della, and no hand could touch that pain, August, because it did not live in the body. It lived somewhere deeper than that. He listened to all of it, and when she was finished, he did not offer comfort, did not say what everyone always said, that it was not her fault, because he understood that with this kind of pain, comfort only made it feel unseen. He only said softly that he thanked her for telling him, and in those few words there was more than in any consolation. Then Maren did something that surprised them both. She stood and found her way to the piano, the Bosendorfer he had brought to the mansion after the auction and placed in a private room he had never entered, and she told him to take her to his mother's piano. The Bosendorfer. He had never dared hear it, let her play it for him. August sat motionless for a long while, because this was the very thing he had avoided for months, the sound that would pull him back to the wooden floor of childhood, and to the woman whose hands had been silent for so long. But then he stood, and he led her through the hallway to the closed room, and he opened the door, and he guided her to the piano. Maren sat down, found the keys with the hands that understood this piano better than the man who owned it, and she began to play, not a showy piece, but a slow and tender melody, and the music rose and filled the room that had been silent for 10 years, and August stood there in his own darkness, listening to his mother's piano sound for the first time after all those years, and this time he did not run from it. He let it pass through him, let it pull him back to the late afternoons of childhood, and to the feeling that a house had once known how to be gentle, and something inside his chest, something that had been locked away even longer than the secret of his heart, finally broke open softly and began to heal. Dad stayed silent for 3 weeks, and that silence itself was a form of speaking, because in 30 years of service, he had learned that some things were better allowed to reveal themselves than pointed out. He ran the house with his usual precision, handled the duties that needed handling, and watched. He watched the way his master now moved through the mansion differently than before, and it took him some time to find the word for that difference. August moved like a building that had just remembered it had rooms. Before, he had passed through his own house, as though passing through a place sealed against the weather, closed, self-sufficient, letting nothing in and nothing out. But now something had opened, some door somewhere had been left ajar, and light was slipping through in ways Thad, who had watched this man longer than anyone still living, could not fail to notice. One evening, he found August in the library, reading something that was not work papers, which in itself was unusual, and he stood at the threshold long enough for the silence to become an invitation. Thad said she knew everything now, not as a question. August answered without looking up everything. His heart, what he did, what he was. She had not run from any of it. Thad entered, and sat down in the chair across from him, something he only did when the conversation required it. And August looked up at that gesture, because he understood the grammar of the man who had been beside him for nearly his entire life. Thad said, "Sir," and his voice carried the weary gentleness of someone about to say a thing he had held back for too long. He had been silent, because he did not know how to say this without sounding cruel. But he had served August too long to be silent now out of cowardice. That woman would have to witness it. August understood that, didn't he? His heart could stop on any day, in any room, and if she was beside him when it happened, she would be the one who had to go on living with that image. He had allowed a woman who had already lost too much to love a man who might leave her with the very loss she feared most. Did he have the right to do that to her? The question fell into the room with the weight of something that already carried its answer, and August sat with it, and for the first time he did not defend himself against Thad, did not raise the familiar wall. He said softly that Thad was right. That was exactly what he feared most. Thad sat a little straighter, and he said the thing he had spent 3 weeks deciding whether to say. There was one thing August had never allowed him to mention again since the doctor spoke of it 6 years ago. The doctor had spoken of surgery, one that might repair what was broken, or at least give him many more years. But it carried high risks, and worse than the risk, it required August to disappear. Weeks of recovery, perhaps months, during which he would be weak, unable to run anything, and his whole world would know he had left the board. He had said no, immediately, without consideration. Because to him then, leaving the board meant letting the Solaire house and every other enemy tear apart what his father had left behind. He had chosen to keep power instead of keeping his life, and he had called it duty. Thad stopped, and he looked straight at the man he had spent his life serving. But he wondered, sir, whether now, when for the first time in many years August had a reason to want to live, and not only a reason to win, that answer was still the same as it had been 6 years ago. In those same days, on the other side of the city, Maren was facing her own question too, and the person who forced her to face it was Josie. One evening, when Maren came home later than usual with the distant air she had been carrying back from the mansion lately, Josie muted the show she was watching and said, in the voice she rarely used seriously, that Maren could either tell her about the man who was taking up all the space in her mind, or Josie would have to guess for herself. Maren stopped in the doorway, and she realized she had kept this to herself for too long, not because she did not trust Josie, but because she had not understood it well enough to put it into words. But now, while Thad on the other side of the city was forcing August to face his truth, perhaps it was time for her to face her own. She admitted there was someone, then sat down in the chair across from her friend, and he was more complicated than anything she had ever been involved in. He lived in a dangerous world, Josie. She would not lie about that. And he was carrying an illness that could take his life at any moment. Josie was silent for a while, that rare silence of hers. Then she said what a good friend had to say. Maren. She had already lost so much. She had lost Della, lost her sight, lost the entire future she once had. And now she was saying she was walking straight into something that would almost certainly make her lose even more. Josie did not understand. She did not understand why, out of all the people in the world, Maren would choose someone she would almost certainly have to bury. The sentence was blunt and cruel in the way only love allows, and Maren was not angry, because she knew Josie said it out of fear for her. She sat with that question for a long while, and when she answered slowly, as if discovering the answer herself while speaking it aloud. She said Josie was right about everything. She could lose him. Perhaps she would lose him. And she had thought about that more than Josie knew, had lain awake through many nights calculating the cost of it. But this was what she had realized, Josie. For the past 3 years, she had lived by avoiding anything that might hurt her again. She had built a small and safe life where she never wagered anything large enough to lose, and she had called that healing. But it was not healing, it was hiding. She had survived for 3 years without truly living a single day. She stopped, found Josie's hand in the space between them, and held it. And this man, despite everything he carried, had made her want to live again. Not because he saved her. She did not need to be saved, and he did not need her to save him. But because for the first time in 3 years, she felt she was truly present in the world, instead of only waiting for it to pass. If she chose to stay, she was choosing it with open eyes, knowing exactly what it might cost her. But she would rather love something real and lose it than keep living the safe life she had never truly lived. Josie looked at her friend for a long time, at the woman who had walked through fire and emerged more enduring. and at last she squeezed Marin's hand and said, in a voice that had softened, that if this was what Marin chose, then she would stand beside her, whatever the ending might be. And Marin smiled inside her own darkness, knowing she had made her choice not as someone being rescued, but as someone who had finally chosen to rescue her own life by daring to live it. The tropical storm struck New Orleans on an evening, near the end of the month, pouring over the city the kind of thick, violent rain that left people unable to hear anything but water, and perhaps it was that rain that kept Marin from hearing the workshop door open behind her. She was alone, working late on a client's piano, and the first thing that told her someone was in the room was the change in the air, the shift she always sensed. But this time it carried a quality that made her blood run cold, because the attention moving toward her was nothing like anything she had ever felt from August. It was cold and purposeful and not gentle at all. A man's voice spoke her name, Miss Calloway. Smooth in a false way, and Marin straightened, turning toward it, her hand tightening around her cane. He said she did not know him, but he had spent quite a bit of time learning about her. His name was Silas Drew, and he had come to ask her a few questions about a mutual friend. Marin did not step back, though every instinct in her warned her of danger. She said she did not think they had any mutual friends, keeping her voice calm. Drew answered that they did, August Rail, and she heard his footsteps come closer, slowly, the way a man moved when he believed he was in control. He said people had told him she had a special gift, that she could touch someone and know the things they were hiding, and he needed her to confirm something very specific about their friend's health, something some doctor had whispered to the people who paid him. But a whisper was not enough. She understood that the people he worked for needed something firmer than the word of an old doctor drowning in debt. And in that moment, amid her fear, a piece fell into place in Marin's mind, the source of the leak she had once heard August worry over. It was not a traitor among his inner circle. It was the very doctor he had trusted 6 years earlier, the man who had known the truth but had never been allowed to write it down, and now, trapped in debt and bought by the Solaire house, he had sold the one thing he knew. But because there were no records, no hard proof, his word was only a whisper, and the Solaire house needed someone like Marin to turn it into certainty. The fear August had lived with for 6 years, the fear of letting a doctor write his illness on paper, had never been paranoia. It had been a true instinct about the very man who would betray him. Marin said she had nothing to tell him, and her voice hardened. And even if she did, she would never tell him. She heard Drew breathe out in irritation, heard him take another step, and she tightened her grip on the cane, preparing for whatever she could not see coming. But at that exact moment the workshop door burst open again, and the room suddenly filled with new sounds, heavy, quick footsteps, the voices of August's men, the men he had quietly stationed to watch over her for weeks, now rushing in between her and Silas Drew. There was a short struggle in the darkness, the crash of furniture overturning, harsh breathing, the sounds of bodies fighting. And Marin stood with her back against the piano, clutching her cane, her heart pounding, trying to read the chaos she could not see through sound alone. And then, through all that noise, she heard a voice tear across the room, a voice she would have recognized anywhere, low and fierce and filled with a fear she had never heard in it before. August's voice calling her name, and she heard his footsteps racing toward her across the room. And even as he reached for her, she had time to think that he should not be running, that his heart could not bear him running like that. He reached her and pulled her into his arms, and for one moment, she felt relief run through his whole body, the relief of a man who had found the thing he had feared he had lost. But in the very next second she felt it, his body suddenly going rigid, his breath cutting short, and he staggered against her with a weight his legs could no longer hold. All the panic, all the sprint across the room, all the fear compressed inside him when he saw her threatened, everything came crashing onto his already damaged heart at once, and now it was betraying him more violently than ever before. Marin did not panic. The part of her that had spent years staying calm, in moments when other people fell apart, took control at once, and she let both of them slowly sink to the floor, supporting him against her, and her hand went straight to his chest, reading the rhythm hammering wildly beneath her palm. And what she read sent a chill down her spine, because this was not a mild episode like the afternoon in the music room. This was something far worse, a heart losing control completely, beating fast and erratic, and growing weaker in a way her instincts told her was deadly dangerous. She said his name, August, her voice clear and steady through the sound of rain, telling him to listen to her. His heart was not regulating itself this time. Not this time. She needed to call emergency services, right now, and she felt him react even through the pain, that lifelong reflex rising in him, his weak hand finding her wrist as if to stop her, because calling emergency services meant a hospital, meant records, meant the truth about August Rail's heart, finally being written down in ink on paper, recorded in a system the whole world could touch, the very thing he had sacrificed 6 years of his life to prevent from happening. He whispered that he couldn't, and even now his voice was still trying to cling to control. If it went into the records, he was finished. The Solaire house would destroy him. But Maren cut him off, and she said the one thing only she could say in that moment. August, listen to me. You sacrificed 6 years to keep this secret because you believed that letting people know you were weak meant death. But look at what's happening. It's keeping the secret that's killing you. Not the weakness. The hiding. And I'm not going to sit here holding you in my arms and watch you die to protect a secret, when that secret has never protected you. There was a suspended moment, as long as an entire lifetime, when she felt the struggle inside him beneath her hand, a whole life of control fighting against something new and more terrifying than death, trust. And then she felt it, his hand loosening around her wrist, no longer stopping her, and he said, so softly it almost disappeared beneath the rain, one single word, call. And in that word there was more than surrender, there was release, the moment a man who had carried something far too heavy for far too long finally set it down. Maren called emergency services with one hand while the other stayed on his chest, her voice calm as she gave the address, as she described his condition, and all the while she kept talking to him, keeping him awake, counting his breaths with him the way she had in the music room, telling him to stay with her, telling him that allowing her to make this call was braver than all the years he had spent being brave by hiding, and beneath her hand she felt his heart still beating that frightening, damaged rhythm, but it was no longer beating alone in the dark. It was beating beneath a hand that knew how to listen to it. And while she waited for the sirens to cut through the rain, she swore to herself that she would not let it stop. 3 days after the storm, August fully woke in a hospital room flooded with the kind of white light he could not see, but Maren could feel through its warmth on her skin. And the first thing he became aware of was her hand in his, because she had been there for 3 days, hardly leaving at all. The doctors had told him what he had known for a long time, that his heart could not continue like this, that the episode had been one final warning, and that there was a surgery, the very surgery he had avoided for 6 years, one with many risks but the only real hope of giving him more years. And now, lying in that room, August understood that the true choice before him had never been between life and death, because death had been his companion for 6 years already. The true choice was between daring to live honestly, accepting that he would vanish from the underworld long enough to heal, accepting that he would hand over the organization he had carried on his shoulders like a coat too heavy for him, accepting that he would be weak and be seen in that weakness, or else continuing to clutch power in his fist until it died with him, and giving that clinging the beautiful name of duty. For 6 years he had chosen the second path. But those were 6 years when he had no reason to want to live except the desire to win. He said softly that he would have the surgery, and he felt Maren's hand tighten around his. He would turn the organization over to the people he trusted. Thad could handle the transition, and the old man had been waiting for him to make this decision longer than August had realized. He would disappear from that world, and perhaps when he returned, he would no longer be the man whose name people lowered their voices to say. And he found that he was not as afraid of that as he once thought he would be. He turned his face toward her and said he was choosing this because of her, Maren. Their bond was never about a sudden rescue or altering who they were, but about a shared understanding. But because, for the first time in many years, he had a reason to want to stay in this world, and that reason was sitting there holding his hand, Maren listened, and when she answered, she did not use beautiful words. She said the simple, true thing she had decided in the darkness of her apartment. She said she would stay. She knew he might not have as much time as other people. She knew she might be the one who had to witness it. She had thought about all of that, and she was still staying, not because she was blind to the danger, but because she had chosen it with her eyes open. What she could give him was not a healthy heart. She did not have that miracle. What she could give him was this, that she would not let him carry it alone for one more day. Then she did what she had done that first night in the auction room. She placed her palm on his chest, over the heart that had brought the two of them to each other, and she read its rhythm, the rhythm still damaged, still uneven, still exactly what it was. She said softly, smiling, that it would always be chaotic. That was what he had been made of, and no matter how successful the surgery might be, perhaps it would never beat perfectly. But listen, August. Now it was no longer beating alone. And the man who had once been the most powerful in the city, the man who had spent his whole life making sure no one could touch him, lay in that white hospital room and let a blind woman hear his heart. And for the first time he did not disappear. He stayed fully seen and no longer alone. A while later, when she was about to go outside so he could rest, he called after her, in a voice lightened of a weight it had carried for far too long. Thursday, the rhythm of return that had carried them all this way, and she stopped at the doorway, turned toward his voice, and answered. Thursday, and for the first time in many years, August Rail had something to look forward to that was not a battle. The story of August and Maren reminds us of one simple thing we often forget, that true strength does not lie in never falling, but in the courage to let another person see us at our weakest, that the deepest healing is not being rescued, but being understood, and that the worth of a human being has never been measured by how strong or perfect they are, but by whether they dare to live truthfully and dare to let someone else step into the darkest rooms of their heart, because even a damaged heart, eyes that can no longer see, and a life filled with loss can still find light when there is someone willing to stay and listen. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share it so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories. How do you feel about August and Maren's story? And what part of their journey made you think the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because we always read and cherish every line of emotion you send us. Thank you for listening until the very final moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Goodbye and see you again in the next videos.